Today at the National Press Club, author and former foreign correspondent Nick Bryant, drawing on his decades-long journalism career and doctorate in American politics, he'll reflect on Australia's role as a consequential global player. Nick Bryant with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to this very special Westpac address from the National Press Club. I'm Mark Kenny, Director of the ANU's Australian Studies Institute, and I'm delighted to be introducing to you today Nick Bryant to deliver the 2024 Australia and the World Lecture. And a special welcome to the Stephen Fitzgerald Scholars who are also with us here in the room, the 2024 intake. Dr. Bryant is a well-known voice in Australian media, particularly as events in American politics rose to their astonishing climax in recent weeks. Perhaps we haven't even seen the climax yet, who knows. Nick is the author of several influential books, including his most recent The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself, and his stunning 2020 book, When America Stopped Being Great, A History of the Present. Not only does this book sit on display in the Oval Office, but last week it was listed as one of the best 21st century history books available by the Book Authority. Nick has been described as a Brit who understands a Brit who understands America, but he is also a Brit who has chosen to live in Australia. Please welcome Dr. Nick Bryant with this year's Australia and the World Lecture.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Let me say at the beginning what a treat and privilege it is to be invited to deliver this annual lecture. It's great to reconnect with ANU. It's great to reconnect with Mark Kenny, a journalist, commentator, an academic I greatly admire. It's an honour to be invited to speak at the National Press Club. There's no equivalent of these kind of televised talks in either Westminster or Washington. When I first arrived here at the tail end of the Howard years, this weekly ritual struck me as a quintessentially Australian tradition. And that's fitting, because Australian quintessence, Australian distinctiveness, Australian exceptionalism even, forms part of what I want to talk about today. In some ways, this moment reminds me of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, another monumental milestone. Back then, some of the history lectures at the university where I was studying would make great dramatic play of ripping up their lecture notes because events were coming at us so thick and fast. As the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Empire disintegrated before our eyes, we were in the throes of a paradigm shift. It was out with the old and in with the new, a maxim which applied as well to the dogged lectures my lecturers and professors have been delivering term after term, year after year. I haven't ripped up the lecture I planned to deliver, but I'll save it for another day. It was entitled The Consequential Country. And I was going to make the case that a nation which has often been defined by its remoteness and irrelevance needs to embrace its growing centrality and consequentiality in global affairs. I was going to argue that it's time to dispense with so many outdated shibboleths that have had such a crippling and self-belittling effect on the Australian mindset. Lucky country thinking, mother country thinking, cultural cringe thinking, tyranny of distance thinking. Those 5,000 words or so will remain on my laptop and sometime in the future hopefully see the light of day. But this moment seemed too urgent. The consequences of Donald Trump's victory seemed too vital to ignore. So forgive me for altering the subject matter of my lecture and also its rubric. The overarching theme of this lecture series is Australia and the world. Today I want to talk about Australia and the Trumpian world. Others can speak with more authority about the impact of Trump's victory on AUKUS, an acronym, admittedly, which to me has always sounded like an affliction. I've got a bad case of AUKUS. Others are more qualified to address the impact of Trumpism on the economy, the environment, and on a rules-based international system that Australia has often helped construct. In recent decades, Australia's growing diplomatic influence has been institutionalised in bodies such as APEC and the G20. It's not the Trump effect on geopolitics I want to talk about, it's the Trump effect on domestic politics. Here I would suggest the question of safeguarding Australian democracy is too narrowly framed. Though I'm not suggesting a direct equivalence, the task is not only to protect Australia against foreign interference from countries such as China and even India, but the foreign influence of its closest ally, the United States. Too often, it feels like an IV line has been laid along the bed of the Pacific through which American toxicity flows directly into the Australian political bloodstream. I want to preface my lecture with two brief love letters. The first addressed to America, a country I've often felt more at home in than Britain, my actual homeland. Travelling to America as a 16-year-old was transformative. I arrived in Los Angeles on the eve of the 1984 Olympics, the start of America's great summertime of resurgence, the moment the country got its mojo back after Vietnam, Watergate, and the Iranian hostage crisis. America's self-confidence rubbed off on me, and I left 6 weeks later with a newfound sense of ambition and a newfound sense of possibility. I applied to a university, which previously I thought was out of reach for kids from my kind of background. In pursuing my career, I wanted to live out my own version of the American dream, to cover Washington for the BBC. I got to report on the most epic history. Once-in-a-lifetime stories seem to come along every couple of years. The Clinton impeachment, the disputed 2000 election, the attacks of September the 11th, the election of Barack Obama, the rise of Donald Trump. I was on the inaugural platform when Trump raged about American carnage. I was on the inaugural platform when Joe Biden uttered the words, "Democracy has prevailed." Not out of a sense of triumph, but out of a sense of profound relief. He was standing, after all, on the very spot which the MAGA mob had used as a staging post to storm the US Capitol. I've been embedded with US forces in Afghanistan, often with Australian cameramen at my side. I saw that 9/11 war up close and often relied on American firepower to keep me safe, to keep me alive. I've had the thrill of repeatedly travelling the road to the White House, journalistically, my favourite ribbon of highway. What you will hear today, then, is not the speech of a knee-jerk anti-American. Quite the opposite. I'm mindful, too, that this stage was occupied on Monday by Caroline Kennedy, whose father, JFK, actually sparked my initial interest in America. He was the subject of my doctorate and first book, which looked at Camelot through a more critical lens. But even as I questioned the romanticism of Kennedy mythology, I recognized that JFK was an inspirational figure, and so too is his daughter. Caroline Kennedy is a model ambassador, both for her country and her family. It's the kind of politics now personified by her cousin, Robert F. Kennedy, that I'm addressing today. Often I recall the speech John F. Kennedy planned to deliver in Dallas on the day of his assassination, railing against what he called ignorance and misinformation. His prepared text warned of voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality, and of a worrying rise in anti-government sentiment amongst conspiracy theorists. They fear the supposed hordes of civil servants far more than the actual hordes of opposing armies, he would have said. We cannot expect that everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to nonsense. Prescient words. My second love letter is to Australia, another country in which I felt an instant sense of belonging. When I first visited more than a quarter century ago, the country combines so much of what I loved about America and so much of what I loved about Britain, while editing out many of the bits that weren't to my liking. British snobbery, American filter coffee. Later, I realised I had drastically shortchanged this polyglot land, whose national identity has also been shaped, of course, by the ancient continuous civilization of the owners of this land, and also by immigrants from all over the world. Australia is where so many traditions meet, and a country which benefits from them all. In many ways, it's what makes modern Australia so emphatically Australian. There are times when I've been a cheerleader for this country. There are times when I've been a critic. I once described Canberra as the coup capital of the democratic world, coinage that stuck. But I also described Australia as the lifestyle superpower of the world, coinage which didn't, which perhaps speaks of the self-belittling streak that I had originally planned to tackle. 3 years ago, we returned to Australia because this is where my wife and I wanted to raise our children, and to raise them as Australians. They travel the world with emus and kangaroos on their passports, although our youngest daughter also has travel documents embossed with the American eagle. The point, I hope, is amply made. These are two countries I adore. Our return from America to Australia actually provides my starting point today. It was in the midst of the COVID pandemic. We were quarantined for 2 weeks at a hotel in the heart of Sydney's CBD. On that first Saturday morning, we heard the muffled roar of a protest down below. What we quickly realised was an anti-lockdown protest, something I recognised from the States. These street rallies were also unfolding in Melbourne, where protesters brandished banners that I was more used to seeing in Mississippi and rural Michigan. One protester held aloft a Trump 2020 flag. Another carried a banner showing the former US Commander-in-Chief dressed in a Rambo bandana and holding a bazooka in his muscly grip. The tribunes, ensigns, and iconography of Trumpism. These were not the only Trumpian props that had made it to Australia. Through the streets of the Victorian capital, a protester paraded a fake gallows with 3 nooses hanging from it. Another gallows was driven through the streets, upon which was briefly flown an inflatable Daniel Andrews punching bag. Unruly demonstrators, in what seemed like another admiring nod towards the insurrectionists of January the 6th, even urinated on the Shrine of Remembrance, Melbourne's most sacred site. The American right frequently bemoaned the severity of Fortress Australia lockdowns. The governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, questioned whether America should still have the same diplomatic relations with Australia. Senator Ted Cruz attacked the COVID tyranny, as he called it, of a country he regarded as the Texas of the Pacific. The right-wing talk show host, Candace Owens, asked seemingly rhetorically, when do we invade Australia and free a suppressed people who are suffering under a totalitarian regime? Donald Trump Jr. also added his voice to this howl of protest. "Don't Australia my America," he tweeted in September 2021. But I found myself thinking the complete opposite. Don't America my Australia. Along with the street Trumpism on display in Melbourne and Sydney, a small t Trumpism had found a home in Canberra. The then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, had a wholly different persona from Donald Trump, but there were similarities nonetheless. ScoMo also had a background in brand promotion and marketing, and a penchant for sloganeering. Stop the Boats was an Australian forerunner of Build the Wall. Scott Morrison was also criticised for falsehoods and exaggeration. He was skilled in the populist trick of reducing the complex to the simple. In attacking Labour's electric vehicle policies ahead of the 2019 election, he said Bill Shorten wants to end the weekend. When, after Australia's withdrawal from the submarine deal with France, Emmanuel Macron was asked whether the Prime Minister had lied to him, he responded, "I don't think, I know." But even though the French president went out of his way to speak of his respect for the Australian people, during that highly personalised diplomatic row, Scott Morrison spoke of the statements that were made questioning Australia's integrity and the slurs that had been placed on Australia, not me. Then he added, "I'm not going to cop sledging of Australia." The former immigration minister also came close to ventriloquising Donald Trump. If border protections were weakened, he claimed in 2019, asylum seekers with criminal records might be granted entry. They may be a paedophile. They may be a rapist. They may be a murderer, he said, using language reminiscent of Trump's attack on Mexican immigrants at the launch of his presidential campaign in 2015. The Morrison government's legislative agenda also seemed to borrow from the GOP field manual. The government planned to enact a potentially restrictive new voter ID law, which Indigenous leaders protested would have penalised First Nations people and imported US-style voter repression. This, despite the Australian Electoral Commission asserting that the problem of voter fraud is vanishingly small. Labour politicians complained of a US segregationist Jim Crow legislation, a framing that again demonstrated the American influence on political discourse. This unneeded reform was later shelved. Scott Morrison raised the issue of transgender sport ahead of the 2022 election, despite Australia's sporting codes dealing with issues of participation effectively themselves. Moderate Conservatives openly expressed concerns about the rightward lurch of the party and its shades of Americanisation. We could become the Republican Party, warned the then Liberal MP Dave Sharma, a former diplomat who got to observe Washington's increasingly radicalised politics up close during a stint at the Australian Embassy. When the news emerged that Scott Morrison had been secretly sworn in during COVID to 5 additional ministries, this prime ministerial power grab was criticised for its lack of transparency and its norm-busting. His former cabinet colleague, Ken Wyatt, described it as disappointing for our democracy. Like his predecessor, Peter Dutton has faced accusations of Trumpifying the Liberal Party. He has tried to reposition the Liberals as the friend of the worker and not the friend of big business, a populist realignment. He stoked a culture war clash by urging consumers to boycott the supermarket giant Woolworths over its decision to no longer stock Australia Day-themed merchandise. Immigration, he suggested earlier this year, was making worse the housing crisis, causing congestion on roads, making it harder for parents to get their kids into school and to see a GP. As Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton faced criticism for claiming that Victorians were scared to go out to restaurants because of African gang violence, and for asking his department to look into a special refugee intake of white South African farmers. Immigration levels should never be a political taboo. It's a debate that every country has to have. But it's how you conduct that debate that matters, because voicing concerns over immigration can easily lurch into the scapegoating and demonisation of immigrants. Last year's Voice referendum, a uniquely Australian debate, often sounded strangely American. When in April Peter Dutton first announced his party's opposition to a yes vote, he spoke repeatedly of a Canberra voice, an echo of the anti-Washington rhetoric that has become standard fare on the American right. There were further American overtones when Peter Dutton dramatised the dangers of the voice. Here he cited 3 scenarios: potential disputes over the expansion of defence bases, funding allocations in the federal budget, and most tellingly, what is taught in schools. In arguing that the voice may make a representation, seeking that a particular version of Australian history be taught in classrooms, he seemed to be alluding to an angry new front in the American culture wars, the teaching of history in schools, which gets into critical race theory. In short, Peter Dutton bemoaned how the Indigenous voice to Parliament was truly a symptom of the madness of identity politics which has infected the 21st century. Ahead of the Voice referendum, he also complained of a process that's rigged because the ACC ruled that a tick would likely count as a yes, but a cross would not be counted as a no. Yet that decision adhered both to precedent and the strict letter of electoral law. In robust terms, the AEC completely and utterly rejected the claim it was acting unfairly and complained the criticism was based on emotion rather than the reality of the law. But that's the direction of travel, politics based on feelings rather than facts. Given Trump's emphatic victory, it will be tempting to follow his lead. Peter Dutton's friend and political ally, Gina Rinehart, was at Mar-a-Lago on the night of the Trump restoration. The billionaire said she wanted to see Australia watch and learn from Trump and declared his election a full-throttle repudiation of all things left. It's not just the Liberal Party. Pauline Hanson has talked of draining the billabong. The United Australia Party sometimes sounded like a Trump tribute band with its slogans, "Put Australia first" and "Make Australia great." And it's not just federal politics. In the western suburbs of Sydney, Cumberland City Council banned books about same-sex parenting from the council's libraries, perhaps offering an indication of how the Australian people reject these kind of US-style book bans. More than 40,000 people signed a petition and the ban was quickly lifted. Recently, the abortion issue, which was considered long settled, has reappeared in Queensland and South Australia. Cancel culture has been embraced by both the left and the right, and it's not just the Australian anti-lockdown movement that has imported forms of protest from America. The statue targeting of the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd summer was mimicked here. More recently, we've seen vandalism targeted at the office of the Jewish federal Labor MP, Josh Burns. The caricaturing of Australia's inner-city elites is a reworking of the vilification of America's bi-coastal elites, whereby Marrickville serves as Martha's Vineyard. But Marrickville's favourite son, Anthony Albanese, is alert to the danger. This member of the Labor left tries to avoid the language of the American left. His image makers must therefore have been delighted with the headline in the Daily Telegraph ahead of the 2020 election after an interview he conducted with the paper. "I am not woke," it read, even though he hadn't apparently used that American phrase. The recent backflips and contortions over questions of gender and sexuality in the 2026 census seem to show both the fear of being wedged on identity politics and the fear of alienating minority groups who are often so unfairly marginalised and maligned. Labour is facing a version of the problem now confronted by the Democrats in America and progressive parties the world over. Should they make economic, ideological and cultural concessions to Trump-style populism? And what precisely should those concessions be? The Americanisation of Australian politics, of course, is nothing new. The infamous anti-carbon tax rally outside Parliament in 2011, featuring the Ditch the Witch placard, had shades of the Tea Party movement. Pre-Trump, political debate had already become more binary, polarised, emotions-based and reflexively contrarian. Federal politics has become more relentlessly oppositional. Canberra seemed better at producing leaders of the opposition than heads of government. But even if Americanisation is not new, it's becoming more pronounced. The Trump effect has not necessarily made politics more brutal. Much of the cannibalistic bloodletting in the party rooms predates the golden escalator. But I suggest the Trump effect has made politics here more cynical, more angrily partisan, more culturally charged, and overly politicised. We're in danger of following that American trait of politicising everything, of turning every aspect of national life into a political combat zone. What makes this all the more worrying is that the frustrations, problems and grievances that populism feeds off are already here in abundance. Returning to America 2 years before Trump announced his presidential bid, I was struck immediately by how few parents believed their children would lead more abundant lives than they did. They'd lost faith in intergenerational progress. So it came as no surprise that one of Donald Trump's most resonant lines came when he told supporters that the American dream was dead. Returning to Australia 3 years ago, I heard the exact same thing. Parents do not believe their kids will be better off than they are, especially when it comes to affording property and buying a home, the essence of the Australian dream. In 2022, 72% of Australians believe that children born today would be worse off than their parents. Among advanced nations, that's the highest figure in the world. Democracy works best for everyone when the economy works best for everyone. Political polarisation is a product of income polarisation. There is a missing middle in American politics because there is a missing middle in the American economy. If you don't live with the hope of enjoying a more abundant life, then it's easy to fall prey to the fear-mongering of populist politics and its nostalgia for a mythic past. In his scorching 1964 polemic, The Lucky Country, Australia in the 60s, Donald Horne not only complained that Australian politicians were second-rate, but that the country was second-hand. Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. It's the quote that has echoed down the decades. A line, incidentally, that didn't work so well in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or for abbreviated spells in this century either. But it was his largely neglected next line that got to the nub of Horne's thesis. Australia lives on other people's ideas. Horne bemoaned how this country was lazily imitative, inheriting and mimicking Britain's system of governance. As he later explained, I had in mind the idea of Australia as a derived society. If Donald Horne were alive today and looking at the influence of Donald Trump, maybe he would double down on his thesis. But what I want to argue today is that Australia has long had a democratic tradition that is quintessentially Australian. For sure, Horne's thesis was seductive, that the country lives off other people's ideas. One only had to look at the Australian Parliament. The nomenclature of the House of Representatives and Senate was imported from Washington. Much of the furniture looked like it had been shipped in from Britain. But for all the ceremonial and procedural similarities, Horne's thesis was too self-belittling. Rather than being imitators, Australians have been the inventors of a homegrown version of democracy. In 1902, with the passage of the Commonwealth Franchise Act and Electoral Act, Australia became the first country where women could stand for Parliament. Its secret voting through ballot papers and closeted voting booths was taken up in America in the late 19th century, where it was called the Australian ballot, though it initially copied the first-past-the-post system used in UK parliamentary elections. In 1918, it adopted preferential voting for the House of Representatives. On October the 10th, 1924, compulsory voting was signed into law. As the historian Judith Brett has argued, in the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Australia led the world in electoral reform. There were terrible flaws that took too long to be remedied, the disenfranchisement of First Nations people. But as well as being reactionary, there was also a reformist impulse as well. Weekend polling also sets Australia apart from the US and UK, from the sausage sizzles to voters turning up in budgie smugglers and bikinis. The electoral experience is wonderfully Aussie. The campaigns that precede them can be ugly. But there's always something beautiful about Election Day. Small wonder that Australia's way of doing things has won international acclaim. Australia has succeeded in creating a culture of celebration around elections as full community affairs. That was how the influential Washington Post columnist E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport, a Harvard academic, put it in their 2022 book, 100% Democracy. As well as emulating the spirit of Australian Election Day, they hoped also that America would ape its model of compulsory participation. The United States adopted the secret ballot after Australia tried it first, they wrote. We should do the same with universal voting. Often we speak of a Westminster tradition and use the portmanteau, the Washminster model, but that downplays and even denies its homemade character. And crucially, the Australian model is built on two of the best safeguards against polarisation: compulsory voting and preferential voting. Elections are won by appealing to the middle rather than chasing votes at the extreme. Thankfully, Australia has other democratic safeguards, again, through its own careful design. The Australian Electoral Commission is the global gold standard. Its reputation is unimpeachable. And that's what made Peter Dutton's comments about a rigged process during the Voice referendum so worrying. They threatened to damage its reputation for integrity, the basis of public trust. Admittedly, I am more of a fan of Australian democracy than I am of Australian politics. For much of this century, it's been a grim spectacle as the reform era was replaced by the revenge era and retribution era. But there have been times over the past 50 years when, rather than being lazily derivative, Australian politics has been preemptive and mimicked elsewhere. Consider Tony Blair's New Labour project in the 1990s. Commonly, it is mistakenly assumed that Labour's shift rightwards was an imitation of Bill Clinton's centrist New Democrat agenda. However, lessons in third-way politics was first delivered in an Aussie twang rather than an Arkansas drawl. From Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, as much as William Jefferson Clinton. So strong was the Antipodean influence that Tony Blair has been described as Britain's first Australian Prime Minister. For British Tories in the post-Thatcherite age, John Howard became something of a lodestar, a successful Conservative who could help guide them back to power at a time when Blair was in his pomp. Ahead of the 2005 election, the then Tory leader Michael Howard recruited Lynton Crosby in the hope he could replicate the success he achieved with John Howard. So valuable an asset was Lynton Crosby to the Tories that Boris Johnson labelled him the Wizard of Oz. To describe Australia as a global trendsetter is too strong, not least since its influence has been most powerfully felt in Britain. But nor was it always a global trend follower. It didn't just borrow the ideas of others. Politics frequently was defiantly Australian. The Australian way of life offers yet more safeguards. This country has a robust civil society based on organisations such as the Surf Lifesaver Clubs, the RSLs, the Rural Fire Service, and all manner of sports clubs and associations. There's a clubability about Australia that protects it against the kind of American atomisation identified decades ago by Robert Putnam in his seminal study, Bowling Alone. Australia has a stronger welfare net, a better health system. There are disparities of wealth, and the generational disparities are a real cause for concern. But it doesn't yet have the extreme income polarisation that we see in America. Sky After Dark does not have the clout of Fox News. The judiciary here isn't politicised. Most Australians would be hard-pressed to name a single High Court justice, and long may that continue. Given what has happened in America after the Supreme Court Citizens United ruling, and given how Elon Musk has been throwing his money around during this campaign, the principle of limiting the influence of big money in politics is sound. The challenge is to find a way of doing it that avoids the perception of a stitch-up by the major parties to preserve their duopoly. Australia has other national characteristics that immunise it from Trump-style demagoguery. For a start, Australians have some of the most finely tuned BS detectors on the planet. Rightly, they mock and deride extravagant boastfulness. This is not a country that goes in for leadership cults, even if Kevin 07 got a bit weird. It's a country that memorialises its prime ministers with suburbs named after them in Canberra, and with statues that often don't have plinths. So even posthumously, the feet of prime ministers are kept firmly on the ground. The tall poppy syndrome is often tedious, but against demagogues, it offers a defence mechanism. But it's not the cartoonish elements of Trumpism that are cause for concern. Rather than the vaudeville, it's the venal side of his politics that worries me. The fear that he stokes and feeds off, the xenophobia, the hyper-nationalism, the misogyny. And grievance politics, remember, is so easy. There are always trivial new battles that can be manufactured into culture war clashes. To win elections these days, you don't have to offer solutions. All you have to do is articulate and amplify voter anxieties. COVID has made this a more fragmented country, as states like Western Australia and Queensland almost seem to declare quasi-independence. The voice referendum further divided the country. The atrocities of October the 7th and the war in Gaza have heightened community tensions and torn at the social fabric. In politics, you can deliberately split the country in two and aim to pick up the bigger half. But that sort of destructive divisiveness should not be the Australian way. We have a choice about how far we want to travel down the path of polarisation. We can decide our own future without slavishly following America. Saturday morning has always been my favourite time in Australia, and never more so than when the country goes to vote. So please, don't trade the democracy sausage for a hot dog. Please, don't America our Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that outstanding lecture. It was extraordinary to listen to. Many brilliant points. I think everyone in the audience could see the craft, the brilliant alliteration, and the rigour of those arguments. And I think many things to agree with there. Talking about Trump, I'll kick off the first question.
Sure.
And we'll go to some questions from the press. Talking about Trump, there's been a fair bit of attention, particularly led, I think it's fair to say, by one media company rather than others, about whether Kevin Rudd should be pulled out of Washington. I wonder if you could reflect on that. You've interviewed Trump yourself. You obviously covered American politics at great length and from many angles, as you outlined. And of course, you and I have discussed before the famous conversation that Malcolm Turnbull had with a very newly elected Trump back in 2017. So what's your read of this kind of argument about whether Australia should slot in someone who's a Trump whisperer rather than someone who's perhaps been critical in the past?
Look, I feel I've seen this movie before, and this time I hope it has a different ending. The movie that I saw before involved the British ambassador, the then British ambassador, a guy called Kim Darroch. It emerged that he had sent cables to Washington, to Westminster from Washington. They were highly critical of Donald Trump, and these cables found their way into the Mail on Sunday, which splashed on it. Huge story in Britain. And instantly, Kim Darroch became persona non grata in Donald Trump's Washington. That Monday night, he was supposed to have a dinner with Britain's trade minister and Ivanka Trump, and immediately withdrew from that meal. The trade minister went on its own. Immediately, the White House said, "You will not be welcome in the West Wing." I mean, he just could not do his job. And what the Brits should have done at that point was stand by him. They should have defended him. They say, you know, you don't get a veto over our ambassador. We get to choose. We're a close ally. You've got to respect that choice. But Boris Johnson was the Foreign Secretary at the time. He was just about to become the Prime Minister. Theresa May had sort of adopted quite what I thought was quite a sycophantic approach to how to deal with Donald Trump. They basically threw Kim Darroch under a bus, and he left Washington, and he sort of stepped aside. And I thought that was a moment of British weakness. And I think Australia just should not do that. I think Australia has to stand by Kevin Rudd. You know, you cannot let America have a veto over your diplomatic appointments. And the other point is, you cannot show weakness at the start of a new Trump era, right? I watched many international leaders deal with Donald Trump, and they adopted a whole swathe of different approaches. You know, Shinzo Abe tried to play golf with him and befriend him on the golf course, and it worked to a certain extent, but Donald Trump was still very sort of hostile at times towards Japan. Macron sort of did this kind of faux friendship thing in person, and then he used to lecture him when he gave speeches. Trump hated that. As I said, the British relationship showed how the special relationship, as they love to call it, is really a servile relationship. And Donald Trump repeatedly humiliated Theresa May, the then Prime Minister. It's hard to keep track of British Prime Ministers, I know, but you remember Theresa May. We've got the Australian disease of changing them every 5 minutes. We're winning that Ashes battle at the moment. But the point is that I think Malcolm Turnbull had the right approach. You know, don't be bullied. I think Trump respected Turnbull partly because of his wealth, and Trump told Turnbull he kind of liked him because he was the lawyer that kept Kerry Packer out of jail. He kind of liked the idea of a lawyer who kept billionaires out of jail, you know, for obvious reasons. But I think that's the approach to adopt with Trump. Don't cede ground. And of course, you know, Turnbull insisted on that refugee deal being fully realised, and it was.
Yes, and a few of us were, I suppose, flinching as Donald Trump kept saying through that conversation, "You're worse than us." And he was saying it admiringly. Our first question from Julie Hare.
Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in your comments about kind of the Trumpisation of politics and turning the complex into really simple things. There's a big debate in Australia at the moment around immigration. Bridget McKenzie, Nationals politician last week, said the social compact between Labor, the social compact between society and on migration had snapped. Peter Dutton gave his first press conference yesterday since June, and it was supposedly about nuclear policy, but ended up entirely about international students and plans to stop the number of international students in Australia. During that press conference, he really vilified international students and focused very heavily on the University of Sydney and its leader, Mark Scott. And Mark Scott seems to have become the personification of all of those things, like the inner city elites.
Right.
I'm just interested in your take on what's going on here in terms of the damage to institutions, the turning of complex into simple, and the vilification of immigrants and international students.
Yeah, forgive me, I didn't see those comments by Peter Dutton. I read some of them today, but I didn't see the whole press conference. The last few weeks, by the way, have really been reminding me of covering Trump. I mean, it's not just felt like 24/7, it's felt like 25/8, right? I mean, news is just coming at us thick and fast. I mean, it's just this blizzard of appointments and news. So I'd miss that. Look, I think that speaks of what I've been talking about, doesn't it? To kind of, combine concerns about immigration and then to go on to sort of suggest that universities are these kind of elite institutions. I mean, that has been the course of Republican travel for many years. You know, Richard Nixon always used to rail against the academics of Harvard. You know, he hated that kind of intellectual elitism, and that really worries me. Painting a lot of people who go to university as these sort of out of touch elitists. As I said, I mean, I went to brilliant university. I was so lucky in where I went to university, but I was first generation university. My parents came from working class backgrounds. I was a full grant student. My entire scholarships were paid for because my parents didn't have much money. And now I come across to a lot of people as this sort of elitist, and and it undermines that sense of generational progress, and it worries me when, the universities sort of become this target and immigration becomes this target. America's still in the game partly because of its powerhouse universities. And if Australia wants to try and reconfigure its economy in the 21st century, then a lot of the great innovation is going to have to come from its big powerhouse universities as well. So maligning them's not great. And nor is maligning immigrants. I just really have a different storyline about how immigration has benefited this country enormously. As I said earlier, it's the traditions that people have brought here that make modern Australia so emphatically Australian. It's why it's such a brilliant place to live. And it worries me that we're going to sort of concede too much ground on immigration, and that there's going to be this kind of acceptance that immigration is a bad thing. It isn't. It's vital for your economy, and it's vital, I think, for your national health.
Okay, thank you.
Just quickly on staying on immigration for a moment, do you see any parallel between the opposition, the federal coalition's decision to not support the caps on foreign students and the action that the Republicans took during this Biden term to stop the Biden administration getting greater control of the southern border? Because, I mean, the argument there was that Trump had wanted to keep that issue alive right up until Election Day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the politics that... I'm not sure if there is a direct analogy on that one, actually, because, Trump's politics there was so destructive, weren't they? I mean, literally preventing a kind of bipartisan deal that had been fashioned on Capitol Hill to actually solve the crisis at the southern border. I guess the broader thing is, and this applies to policies all over the world, not just America, not just Australia, not just Britain. Politicians seem to want an issue to run on these days, rather than trying to find a solution. I just make that general point. And I think, the days of sort of constructive bipartisanship have kind of seemed to have gone a little bit. Partly because bipartisanship now is seen as rewarding the incumbents, right? I mean, and this came from the 1990s in America. The Republicans have been out of power for so long on Capitol Hill and the House of Representatives. 40 years they went without occupying the Speaker's chair. That, in those times, the only way that the Republicans could actually influence elections was, influence policy was through the bipartisan legislative process on Capitol Hill. They were never going to be the Speaker of the House, so they had to do it in committees through shaping legislation. But then Newt Gingrich came along and had a totally different approach. He thought that bipartisanship was rewarding the Democrats, and that's why the Republicans never did occupy the Speaker's chair. And that bipartisanship broke down. In fact, there was one leading Republican thinker who likened bipartisanship to date rape. It was just appalling, the kind of way that sort of patriotic bipartisanship that we've seen during the Cold War just ended. And it was partly because of the end of the Cold War. It removed the kind of discipline that had been in American politics for the Cold War years, and it was also a generational shift. People who acted in a sense of patriotic partisanship, members of the greatest generation who'd fought alongside each other in World War II, and understand what a real combat felt like was superseded by people like Gingrich and Clinton, whose formative experience was spent in the culture wars of the 1960s. And after the Cold War, Washington became the new Berlin. It became the place where Australia fought its ideological battles, and they have never recovered that sense of bipartisanship that stemmed from the Cold War. So, you know, it is a huge problem now. Rather than seeking bipartisan solutions to things, politicians increasingly just want to have these issues to run on.
Kim Bergman.
Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. Thank you very much for that. I'd like your views on how the Americans view us, and to narrow it down for you a little bit, particularly in the security space, because Australian politicians and senior officials now reflexively go giddy and weak at the knees whenever they come across a senior figure from the Pentagon, especially if that figure happens to say something nice about Australia. Now, when we look at AUKUS Pillar 1, Australia is in the process of transferring literally billions of dollars to the United States on little more than the belief that in 10 years' time, a future US president, so convinced of the importance of this relationship, will do the right thing. So the question is, do you think that a future US president will do what Australia expects, or will a future US president look after the interests of the US first?
Well, obviously the latter. You know, anybody with a sort of a sense of American benevolence when it comes to these sorts of decisions is living in a sort of cloud cuckoo land. And I mean, that is the weakness at the heart of AUKUS. You know, that when the rubber hits the road or the submarines hit the water, whatever phrase you want to use, you know, will a US president actually sort of deliver on that? And if it goes in contradiction of America's self-interest. You began by asking, how does America regard Australia? And I think that's a really interesting question. And it goes to the self-belittling streak that I was going to address today. I always think there's a kind of perverse pleasure in Australia when, you know, a US president forgets the name of an Australian Prime Minister. We saw it in AUKUS, right? That fella down under for Scott Morrison.
Yep.
You know, apparently Richard Nixon had to ask how to pronounce Billy McMahon's name. That wasn't the only humiliation he suffered on that trip. He was at the Waldorf Astoria, apparently. Mungo McCallum tells this story. And he went to hear Eartha Kitt in Cabaret, and somebody suggested to Eartha Kitt she should actually serenade the Australian Prime Minister. So midway through her set, she did that. The problem was she ended up serenading his security guard. You know, Malcolm Turnbull was called Malcolm Trumbull by Sean Spicer. Yep. You know, and the Aussies delight in this, right? And it's this idea that, you know, your leaders aren't that significant. But, you know, George W. Bush regarded John Howard as his closest ally, a closer ally than Tony Blair. Barack Obama thought he had a mind meld with Kevin Rudd, more so than any other. Gordon Brown hated that at the time. He was so jealous of the relationship that Kevin Rudd had. And as I said, I mean, over the course of the last 30 years or so, your power has been institutionalized. And part of that power has come from Keating persuading Clinton that APEC should be elevated to leader status and heads of government status, and Kevin Rudd persuading George W. Bush that the G20 was the way to deal with the financial crisis of 2008, which was called the Great Recession outside of Australia, by the way. You had the kind of, you know, global financial crisis, whatever. And I think that speaks of a kind of increased stature for Australian prime ministers and an increased recognition about the centrality and consequentiality of Australia in global affairs. You know, I think as recently as sort of maybe 10 years ago, Owen Harris, you know, great foreign policy thinker, spoke of how you needed really good peripheral vision if you were in Washington and you wanted to notice Australia. That's not the case anymore. And actually, AUKUS is proof of that.
Finn McHugh.
Finn McHugh at Capital Brief. Nick, thanks for your time. I want to ask you about the forever war. One of the arguments you make is that sort of no individual anti-democratic tendency that Trump shows is unique in of itself, that it's, you know, they've each been exhibited by a president in the past, but that what makes Trump unique is his own party's unwillingness to rein him in. You write, a frightening number of Republicans appear untroubled by his fascistic tendencies. Obviously, since you wrote those words, Trump hasn't just regained the White House, but the Republicans now have the Senate, Congress, and there's a Conservative Supreme Court. Do you have any hope over the next 4 years that there will be any guardrails on what Trump wants to do?
I'm really worried about that. I mean, the basic argument of the forever war is that Donald Trump is as much a product of American history as Abraham Lincoln, as John F. Kennedy, as Joe Biden, as Barack Obama, as FDR. It's just a history that we tend to forget, the history that we misremember, and the history that often gets deliberately concealed. And if you excavate that history, it makes sense of Donald Trump. There's an authoritarian streak in American history. There's a demagogic streak in American history. There's a nativistic streak in American history. There's a conspiratorial streak in American history. In many ways, Donald Trump brings those together. But as you say, presidents in the past that have displayed authoritarian tendencies have tended to be disciplined and restrained by their own parties. You know, one thinks of Watergate. You know, it didn't have to go to impeachment and conviction in a Senate trial because a group of very senior Republicans drove down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House and told Nixon he had to resign. And they included Barry Goldwater, who ran in 1964 and was regarded at his time as this crazy guy. But Goldwater was amongst those who told Nixon he had to go. When FDR was described as an American dictator during the 1930s, because he really did stretch presidential powers to the limit and arguably exceeded them. When he tried to pack the Supreme Court, which had tried to obstruct his legislative agenda, it was Democrats who said, no, you can't do that. You've got to remain within the bounds of the Constitution. What worries me about Trump is that there aren't Republicans now of that ilk that will stand in his way. And one of the problems about January the 6th, that rather than becoming a moment of repudiation of Trump, it became a moment of further radicalization for the Republicans. You know, people like Liz Cheney, you know, the 10 congressmen and women who voted to impeach Donald Trump, you know, very few of them are still around. They got purged from the party. Trump used that moment to make the Republican Party even more Trumpian. And that's what worries me now. Look, I think they will try and stop some of the really crazy appointments like Matt Gaetz. I think they still will try and preserve, out of a sense of self-respect, you know, the idea that, you know, the Senate just isn't a rubber stamp. But there aren't the voices of moderation and the voices of restraint like John McCain, and they just don't exist anymore. And all of those Republicans know that if they defy Trump, they're probably going to face a primary challenge, a Trumpian primary challenge. So, yeah, I worry about that. I also worry about, you know, just briefly, I mean, there are lots of gaps in the US Constitution. When it came to presidential power, the Founding Fathers wrote those presidential powers very much with George Washington in mind. And there was the feeling that the general who surrendered his war at the end of the War of Independence would be circumspect in his use of presidential power, and he was. George Washington was his own check and balance. But because of that, the Constitution, when it comes to presidential power, was poorly defined, inadequately defined. That's why the Supreme Court had to rule on presidential immunity. And at the moment, you've got a situation where the presidential rule book is going to be written by, the gaps in it are going to be written by a 6-3 Republican-controlled rule book. And that worries me too.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson from SBS World News. Given everything you know, everything you've gathered up over your time covering politics and the US election and living in Australia, who do you think is most likely to win the next Australian election? And as a second part, if I may, what can Australian journalists learn from the US election about how we can cover politics for voters?
Look, can I combine those two questions and say, and if you're a young journalist watching this, you know, please heed these words. Don't predict elections. We're correspondents. We're not clairvoyants. there's this kind of weird streak in modern-day journalism that not only expects journalists to kind of report on what's just happened, it expects journalists to know what's going to happen. I mean, it's crazy. So I never make predictions. I didn't in this election. And one of the reasons why is it corrupts your journalism, right? You tend to look for evidence that confirms your prediction, and you tend to ignore the stuff that contradicts your prediction. And it really kind of undermines the quality of your journalism. So I've got no idea who's going to win the Australian election, and I wouldn't predict it if I did. Look, I think it's going to be a really challenging time for journalists covering Donald Trump. You know, partly because he's been so emboldened, empowered by this victory, partly because, you know, there aren't that many guardrails anymore, partly because he's putting in place people at regulatory agencies like the FCC, people who might go after the major networks and, you know, possibly say to them, you're not going to have your license anymore. You know, it's a worrying time. I think we saw a kind of preemptive act of appeasement from Jeff Bezos ahead of the election when, you know, the Washington Post for the first time in many, many elections didn't actually endorse a presidential candidate. It seemed Jeff Bezos was slightly worried about the commercial fallout from doing so. It's a tough time for journalists. One of my younger colleagues at the BBC, I no longer work for the BBC anymore. I should stress that because what I've said today would go beyond the bounds of the BBC. What he said to me on the night of Trump's election was very profound, I thought, for a young reporter. He said, we're going to have to summon everything we've learned at journalism school and everything we've ever learned on the job. And I think that's true now to the power of 10. You know, I think this is going to be a really challenging moment for journalism. And, I hope our industry is up to the task. Yeah.
If I can just follow up, there has been some discussion around coverage of, say, Trump, but also Trumpian politics in Australia, you know, not focusing on, say, the social media inflammations, but focusing on what the politician does as opposed to what they might say in those forums. Do you think that is potentially one approach that could cut through?
That's often said of Trump, you know, judging by what he does rather than what he says. But often he does what he said on social media he's going to do. And that's exactly what he's doing at the moment, by the way, with his appointments, right? The formulation I used during the first Trump term was, it's shocking but not surprising. And when I saw Matt Gaetz's appointment, I thought, wow, okay, this is the change. It is shocking and surprising. I didn't think he'd appoint Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, America's most senior law enforcement official. But he is doing that at the moment. He believes that, you know, he can be the full Trump. He believes that's what the American people want, and many of them, frankly, do. I mean, that's it was an emphatic victory. I think, you know, we're in danger of exaggerating the victory. To be honest, it wasn't a landslide. It wasn't 49 states out of 50 like Reagan in '84, or 49 out of 50 like Nixon in '72. But it was an emphatic win, and Trump's going to be emboldened by that.
Thank you.
And that's before we even get to appointing people like Elon Musk to be in charge, and just the role of those social media titans, just extraordinary. Well, there's a totally new media, and I think I was there for the Big Bang moment. I think it came during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. We should have called it the Bill Clinton scandal, right? And it was when Newsweek sat on that story that the president was having an affair with an intern, and the story was released by a little-known blog called the Drudge Report. And that night, you know, senior journalists in Washington were filing their first ever online stories. And some of them even had to ask permission to use the internet. I mean, those were the days we were living in back then. And it was kind of the moment when you realize, you know, the traditional gatekeepers of news could no longer control the information flow. And more importantly, there were no gates. I mean, that's the point. And the media now has become so fragmented. I mean, younger people aren't getting their news from, you know, the BBC and other, you know, legacy organisations. They're getting it from people like Joe Rogan and the late night comedians, and, you know, Tony Hinchcliffe, that comedian who made that awful Puerto Rican joke at the Madison Square Garden. Yeah, it's a very different landscape. Melissa Coe.
Corey McLeod from innovationoz.com. Thank you. And I think my question follows on from the last question and also your remarks just then. You mentioned the phrase feelings, not facts. This last election, the Trump election, would be the first since generative AI really put all sorts of things in people's hands, very emotive social media and information and constructing ideas and feelings. Obviously, we have an election next year. Is there anything we can take from that to understand how we do as a country make sure we can maintain some focus on the facts?
Yeah, no, this is a really alarming area, isn't it, AI? And not just in the information sphere, but in the job sphere as well. You know, automation is one of the reasons why there's such a sense of despondency in the Rust Belt. You know, Clinton spoke of building a bridge to the 21st century, but if you lived in one of those post-industrial communities in Middle America, it felt like a bypass. You couldn't figure out how to make a living in an information technology world rather than manufacturing world. And AI is going to really dramatically accelerate that. I was always struck when I went to the Rust Belt towns in 2016 and I arrived in Pittsburgh. Often I would be driven from the airport by a guy who used to work in the steel mills who now drove an Uber. And I was struck by how Uber was the place, Pittsburgh was the place where Uber were figuring out how to develop driverless cars. So this guy got hit by the first wave of automation and he's just about to get hit by the AI revolution as well. And it's not just going to be blue-collar jobs, it's going to be white-collar jobs as well. I think this is a real worry. When we're trying to figure out how to make an economy work for everybody, you know, AI is going to make that a lot more complicated. How to counter, you know, the misinformation and disinformation of AI, it's scary, isn't it? I mean, you'd have seen the deep fake videos that were heading around. I mean, CNN did this extraordinary thing with Jake Tapper, the famous anchor. They literally created a Jake Tapper who introduced the segment in AI. And you just couldn't tell that it wasn't the real Jake Tapper. And this sort of stuff is so super worrying. I mean, it's kind of entertaining, isn't it, in some ways, because you see these hilarious videos, but it's deeply worrying at the same time. And, you know, countering that is really difficult. I mean, the AEC has done a lot of work on this. And I think they realise that, you know, the federal laws just haven't kept pace with the times. And, you know, they've tried to counter misinformation by setting up a kind of YouTube channel, you know, that they've used. And, you know, it's a great innovation, but, you know, it feels very David against Goliath, you know, times 100. And one of the sort of disturbing things about the kind of misinformation world that we live in is facts don't counter mistruths and falsehoods. And I think that, you know, if you're trying to figure out how to counter it, you've got to kind of arouse some of the same sort of feelings as well. That's the battleground now. You know, trying to arouse positive feelings and hopeful feelings rather than giving in to the fearful feelings.
Next question from Steve Lewis.
Thank you. I see you have embraced the Australian dress code by relaxing the couple of top buttons of your shirt.
That was very deliberate. Thank you for noticing.
China, America, Trump's appointed or nominated Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State, Foreign Minister, probably the most hawkish person in DC when it comes to China. Australia is reviving its relationship with Beijing through the Albanese government after a really rocky road a few years back. So what's the future, do you think, for China, America, Australia? Do you think the risk of conflict in the Pacific or over Taiwan is going to be greater as a result of the second Trump presidency? And can Australia play some sort of a role? You talked about our status as a global power. Can Australia play a fair dinkum role in mediating these two superpowers? Remembering, of course, Trump has said he'll impose, 60% tariffs on China, yeah? So, you know, we're in for a conflict, economic, potentially strategic and military.
Yeah.
Can Australia play a role? Is the risk of conflict greater in this region as a result of second Trump presidency? Nick?
Oh, look, when I talk about the consequentiality of Australia, I'm not sure if it can perform quite that level of consequential role, to be honest. I mean, one of the great successes, it seems to me, of Australian diplomacy over the last sort of 25 years ago is actually to sort of balance this relationship between the country that kind of underwrites your security and the country that has underwritten your prosperity, you know, and it seemed pretty successful. And it's required at times a lot of diplomatic dexterity and kind of suppleness. And I guess, I mean, my views aren't particularly strong on AUKUS, but that's the problem with AUKUS. It takes away that suppleness in many ways. You've made the choice now. You've gone with a deal that is aimed at maintaining American preeminence in this region, and you know that's going to make that the tensions between that relationship with China and the relationship with America are even more marked. And I think, you know, that's going to be the challenge. Can Australia play the kind of bridging role? Yeah, I think that's probably overly hopeful. And the problem is, you know, having gone down the AUKUS route, you've closed off that route.
Just quickly, Nick, very quickly on this. Trump's always described as transactional, and I suppose that's kind of embedded in Steve's question. You know, will he be less inclined? Will he be more inclined to make some sort of deal, or see some sort of trade-off in the region, rather than pursue, as previous American presidents have, you know, a bigger geostrategic agenda?
Look, I think this is where I think Trump is so very hard to predict. And I mean, what I'd also say is that so often the question of America's relationship with Australia is perceived through this kind of AUKUS lens now. You know, it's become very reductive. I mean, you know, potentially a far bigger problem for Australia is the impact that Trump is going to have on environmental policies. You know, far more impactful for Australia is the impact that Trump is going to have on trade policies that don't necessarily impact your trade with America. You know, it's what, 4% of your exports, something like that. It's the effect on the Chinese economy that has the effect on the Australian economy. It's that kind of impact that is going to hit you. I think often we just sort of tend to think of this as a kind of AUKUS issue. It's an economy issue, it's an environment issue, it's an everything issue.
Thank you. Now we have Melissa Code.
Here I am. Thanks for your talk. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. This week, the Australian government released the 2024 Trust in Public Services survey, and it found that trust in Australia towards its government was flat. So trust was 58% and satisfaction was 68%. And I guess some of the themes that you've been talking about also dance around notions of hope as well. As government or politics becomes more polarised and we focus more on this idea of the politics of grievance, do you think that takes the oxygen out of the room to have conversations about who we are, who we want to be? And in the case of the referendum, I guess if we were to look at it as an experiment, maybe it totally sucked the oxygen out of that question. Do you think it will ever undermine any hope that Australia might have of becoming a republic one day?
Yeah, lots to unpack there.
And not much time.
Look, on a quick one, who we are is a vital question to ask right now, and what do we want to be? You know, crucial questions. The problem with that question instantly is it's identity politics. You know, you kind of get into this kind of ridiculous sort of binary, moronic kind of lack of subtlety in the political discourse. Any debate now about who we are immediately raises the charge of, oh, this is just identity politics. But who you are is absolutely crucial, and I think, you know, Australia still has some way to go on that. You know, it strikes me as odd that you've still got a British head of state. But the chances of a Republican referendum being introduced is going to take a very brave Australian Prime Minister to go to the country on a referendum again. And this was, in many ways, one of the sadnesses of the voice referendum. I mean, not just for Indigenous Australians, but Australians more broadly. I mean, I obviously recognise the result. It was an emphatic defeat. But it kind of took that kind of nation-defining agenda, it set it back. It kind of put it into kind of regression almost. And, you know, that for me is disappointing because, you know, a thesis of my book, The Forever War, is one of the problems with America is it keeps on fighting the same battles because it never resolves its history. And I think for me that was one of the sadnesses of the voice referendum. Here was the chance to make a grand gesture. Here was the chance to make a gesture that resolved some of Australia's outstanding issues around its history. And that issue wasn't, that opportunity wasn't taken.
Thank you. One last quick question from Nick Stewart.
Terrific lecture. You look at Australia, you see a glass half full. We, of course, as Aussies, see a glass half empty. You know, there seems to have been an increasing lack of discussion in politics here about issues. Increasingly, we focus on leaders and leadership, And so, you know, the Dutton popularity compared to Albo means Albo will be out. And that becomes the way we look at politics. Can that change? Will it change? Should it change?
How long have I got? I've got about 30 seconds, haven't I?
Something like that, yeah.
Oh, look, this hasn't been a great century for Australia, I don't think. I mean, it couldn't have started better, right? You had the Sydney Olympics. What a brilliant way to showcase all that was great about Australia. An opening ceremony, this wonderful retelling of the national story that put Indigenous Australians right in the heart of it. It was just wonderful, and I think the world just watched you and thought, wow, you should just have the Olympics every time. Clive James came up with this great line, Mount Olympus meets Sydney Harbour. You were meant for each other, and they were. But I think the politics of this century, rather than being defined by September 2000, which was the Olympics, I think to a certain extent they came to be defined by what happened in September 2001. You know, there's been a fearfulness in Australian politics, I think, ever since 9/11. I mean, obviously that came just after Tampa appeared on the horizon, and the election in 2001, which ended having such a traumatic effect on Labor and having such a big impact on how immigration is talked about in Australia. And, you know, it hasn't been a brilliant 23 years since, right? I mean, you've had this churn of prime ministers. You've had a politics that is incredibly, you know, destructive and personalised, and you know, it almost seems like Australia's lost the ability to do big things anymore. And the reform era was always based on big things. And as I said, I mean, I think the reform era, sadly, has been sort of replaced by a revenge era and a retribution era. And it's trying to get back to the reform era, you know, big ideas rather than kind of small target politics, you know. An optimism, which always strikes me as the greatest national characteristic that Australia has. There's a reason why, you know, all the cameramen at the BBC are Australians. It's partly because they're so optimistic. They always think they can do stuff. And I think I don't see that as much in modern Australia as when I first came here.
Would you please thank Nick Bryant?
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.